What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for The Necromancer's Tale, a narratively focused CRPG that tells the rise of you, a necromancer, during the 1700s. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform. And while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though in the case of The Necromancer's Tale, it is important that I mention two things. For starters, I got a review key for this one, but it was just before the game launched a few days ago on, I believe it was the 17th. So I got a little bit of a head start, but not really much of one. I just didn't have time to hit the embargo on this. Now, also of note is that currently it looks like there are 4 bugged achievements that aren't working, which are the Spellbook, Raised a Zombie, the Necklace, and Recruitment Drive. 3 of those are directly related to the main story. One of them is technically missable, but is part of the main story nonetheless, and they are not unlocking. The 4th one just having to do with a side quest. So while certainly annoying, just not something I'm going to hold up a review for. With that said, let's actually dive in and talk about the game itself. So, The Necromancer's Tale, as I mentioned, tells the rise of us, a necromancer, during the 1700s. But what's really interesting about it are really all of the systems that take that experience and really flesh it out, pun intended. In fact, I think the only other game that really comes close to this specific experience is something like the Lich Mythic Path and Wrath of the Righteous, and even this greatly expands upon that concept. As a result, if you're into that kind of thing, the story and a lot of the gameplay elements around that are really great, but it does fall short in some other areas, which is not really a surprise given its very small nature in terms of being an indie title, and so some systems and like instructions here and there can feel a little bit unwieldy, but if you're willing to get past that stuff, it really is a really fun time. Let's break some of that down though, starting with the technical state. So for the most part, this game ran pretty well for me. I did experience one crash that was quite the big crash. It wasn't just a crash to desktop. I had to like fully restart my PC. And that was over the course of about 40 hours of gameplay. So, not exactly the end of the world, but of note. It's also got some stutters on occasion, things like that. Nothing that didn't resolve itself pretty much immediately. With the rest, I would say being comparatively minor issues. Pathfinding can occasionally be annoying, especially when you're trying to navigate between different levels of, say, a building, and, like the inventory UI, being unnecessarily particular about where exactly you drop an item into the inventory slot. But beyond that, just a couple of other notes. This game is somewhat voice-acted. Some of the main stuff is voice-acted, the big opening is, things like that, but it is not 100% voice-acted. I know that's important to a lot of people. And there are also some accessibility features, like for instance, the game by default has like this painter effect over the graphics that you can turn off to make it look a little more normal, like you see in my footage. And you can also do things like scale the text of the dialogue window, which will snap things accordingly in case you want to blow up the UI scale. Keeping it moving though, now let's talk about difficulty. So there are 3 difficulties, basically easy, normal, or hard, but what I thought was especially interesting about these is the difference between easy and normal in particular. Normal and hard are pretty much what you'd expect. Hard has more enemies, makes less points available for you, which I'll explain in a second. But on easy in particular, the game actually becomes fully narrative. That is to say, it skips the combat sequences, which are normally turn-based battles you would have to participate in. So this story mode actually turns the game into fully just a story. And instead what it does is it assigns your sort of group a combat rating based on the undead minions and things, and you, of course, as a character and what you have at your disposal, and then it just auto-resolves those combats based on that combat rating. So while the combat is honestly clunky and I think doesn't add a ton to the experience overall, it is obviously worth a mention that you can just skip it entirely and focus on the narrative aspect if that is what you prefer. Next up, let's talk character creation, or the way in which you will define your character, as we do play more or less a set person. But what I thought was really interesting about this character creation is that it takes place either via an interactive novel, in which case you just make various decisions as your character grows up, which then defines your overall character, but you can also choose to apply what is called a quick set, basically just manually make the character with the stats you want. In either case, you'll be able to choose some important stuff, incredibly important actually. Starting with your background, you can be things like, say, a diplomat or a military officer. It also matters if you are male or female. That does change some of the dialogues and things available to you. Background is especially important. It will actually change what your character knows and as a result how people interact with you. And then there is your actual skills. Skills are basically divided up between physical, social, and mental, as is, I would say, par for the course. But this is super important because your skill points here at character creation are pretty much what you're going to have throughout the entire game. There are some interactions where you can lose skill points, or attributes if you prefer, but there's not really any opportunity to gain them, which means what you have is what you have, and that is important because of the way the game deals with various skill checks. Basically, skill checks in dialogue will be for any of these given attributes or skills, and if you meet or exceed it, great, you don't have to spend any extra points, but otherwise, if you fail to meet it, you have to spend from a limited skill point pool that applies per chapter, and once you're out of those for that chapter, you're just done, which means you can't pass any of those checks afterwards. Now, while not technically speaking part of character creation, it is important, so I'm going to go ahead and mention it here, is your actual job. So a short ways into the story, one of the first things you'll be doing is actually choosing from one of 3 jobs available in the city itself. That being a teacher, dock worker, or like a server at a tavern. Now that is important because each of those jobs, as you would probably expect, lines up with the subdivisions of your skills. So physical, social, or mental. You do not have to pick the job that lines up with what skills you have available for you, but you are likely going to have an easier time if you do, meaning that the checks put in front of you will likely be checks you are more likely to pass without spending an exorbitant amount of your skill points. Moving on from there, however, let's go ahead and talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. But with that in mind, I do want to give a pretty big spoiler warning right here. While this game is not entirely story-focused, as it does have things like combat, etc., reality is one of the main reasons you would be playing this game is the narrative in this one. And as a result of that, I really don't want to be the one to spoil this for you. So if that is of concern for you, you may just want to either skip this part entirely or simply go play it for yourself, I suppose. Otherwise, though, the story of the Necromancer's tale takes place in and around the city of Marnes. Marnes is in a country called Rolston, and around the time you were growing up, they fought a war here. Ultimately, people came together to fight a lich, who was, of course, raising the undead and whatnot, and eventually that was put down. But obviously, the after effects of that war have been felt since, and necromancy is kind of a real thing people are afraid of here. And yet, all these years later, despite what caused you to leave home in the first place, being handled as part of character creation, you're going to be called back because your father has recently passed away. So you need to come home and get your affairs in order while also trying to take care of your mother, who is clearly suffering from some mental health problems, or so it would seem. This is why you have to do things like resolve to get a job, handle your family's finances and all that, but in the process of doing this, you uncover a few things. The circumstances surrounding your father's death, who was a war hero from the Lich War, are especially mysterious. None of it quite adds up. And to make things even more interesting, you just so happen to find an arcane-looking tome in his office as you try to get to the bottom of these events. And it is through this arcane tome that you yourself are put on the path of becoming a necromancer, which starts out innocently enough with you simply trying to brew a potion your father was making for your mother that seemed to help with some of her problems. And through these 2 avenues, you slowly and methodically get pulled ever deeper into the tangled web of being a necromancer. And as a result of this, all along the story, you're going to have to do a few things. You're going to have to translate the pages of the book, which are all written in different languages from different periods. This is going to give you access to the various rituals you'll need to perform to advance the story, and the catch is a lot of these rituals, especially because of the Lich War, but also just generally, are extremely frowned upon, let's say. And you do have to actively try to prevent the city at large from finding out about them, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the gameplay section. But the long and short of it is that in doing that, both in terms of how you go about fulfilling those objectives and how you go about hiding things, etc., leads to a ton of choice and consequence, little changes that ultimately culminates in a variety of different endings, but also just a lot of really great, fantastic little granular stuff. For instance, while you can pretty much freely enter or leave the cathedral at first, as you find yourself slipping further into the dark arts, the cathedral is actively actively hostile to you and you can't even bear to be inside of it, which can certainly complicate some of your quests, which involve things going on in there. And that was just a nice sort of touch that you can see unfold over the course of the game. And as a result of that, I think the story is really good. Probably the main reason you're playing this, to be honest. And it was very enjoyable. Now, that does bring us to the progression side of things. So progression is a little simple in the sense that you're not really leveling up or anything. Most of the progression comes from unlocking the rituals in the book, which is going to let you do things like raise various undead minions. But there are also a few other bits of progression, mainly around, acquiring gear. You can equip yourself with a bunch of items, you can equip your minions with items, and you can actually find other spells. So as you gain more and more power, you will gain the ability to also just cast spells. And while a lot of this is centered around directing your minions around, there are also other hidden side things that you can find, such as allowing you to summon various entities in to help you, such as demons or a wraith, or even cast, more traditional magic like a chilling mist that reduces the action points of mortal enemies, that kind of thing. So that kind of takes the bulk of progression for you. Relatively simple system overall, but still kind of impressive in the way that it manages to evoke the feeling of being a necromancer. That does bring us to the gameplay and world section though. So one thing I really like about this game is that you actually have to both navigate the city of Marnes and also get to grips with its people, because this city does not really have any truly generic NPCs. Some of them are less important to be sure, but they are all named. They have a schedule, there's a day-night system, where you personally will advance time here on occasion, but at different times of day, people are at different places, that kind of thing. And you can generally interact with a lot of these characters. There are multiple romances you can get involved in. There are characters you'll need to track down. There are side quests that are meant to be found. A lot of those side quests are actually really good, by the way. There's even one involving a sort of Frankenstein monster. But it doesn't end there, because I mentioned you have to hide your necromantic activities. And that is not just me saying that. There's actual systems in place for that. If citizens do things like find dead bodies, as an example, or stumble upon your ritual remains, or just your actual undead minions, as an example, the concern level of the city will rise, and obviously that has consequences, like making it more difficult to conceal your activities, but it's also possible for you to get caught doing criminal things. This can lead to your arrest by the guards, which then leads to a trial. In simple cases, you might actually get away with these things with only a slap on the wrist, but if they catch you doing actual necromancy, they will hang you, which is, I guess, one of the endings you could say to the game. So the lengths to which you have to go to actually physically hide all of this stuff, on top of the narrative taking place, really just adds a sort of interactive element that I think really captures the idea of someone trying to go ahead with their plans while also actively trying to avoid the ire of the city you find yourself in. And as a result of that, it really does feel much more immersive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you do have that job I mentioned. This is also something you have to take part in. Basically, once a chapter, you have to check in with your job, which will have its own tasks and things for you. This can lead you to some of the side quests that are unique to each one. You can also explore the city door by door, investigating things and finding options for quests. But a lot of that is going to lead into the slightly more awkward stuff I mentioned. So a lot of times you're going to have to combine various items, which is done both in your inventory via the 2 combine spots, but also the occasional station, like say a stove or a forge. And there are plenty of times that can be a little obtuse, frankly. And there are certainly times where I think the game kind of struggles to give you clear instructions. Now, on one hand, I think a little bit of that is intentional. I think, the idea of becoming this necromancer is supposed to be this esoteric thing that you have to work your way through. This does nonetheless lead to moments, especially during like a first playthrough, where you're kind of just wandering around trying to figure out exactly what it is that needs to get done for like 30 minutes to an hour, which can certainly lead to a little bit of frustration. On top of all of that stuff, though, there is, as I mentioned, entirely optional things like a variety of different side quests to get up to, but there are also things outside the city to explore. There's multiple like caves and stuff like that can be found that you don't have to go down at all, but doing so will often lead to the reward of, actual things to sell, to gain money, to help you fund everything else you need to do, but also to things like those spells I mentioned, etc. So there's plenty of reasons to do those things and explore the countryside here. And all of that combined honestly leads to a very replayable experience. I think you could play this probably 3 or 4 times, which is certainly what I did. That does bring us to the combat section, though. So combat, as I mentioned, a very basic turn-based system. It's pretty much you, the occasional bit of help, especially in the early game. Later on, your minions, any spells you can cast, and then of course the things you can summon in. The vast majority of enemies are only capable of melee or ranged attacks, which is also true of all your minions, and you seem to pretty much be the only one who can effectively spellcast, and this means a vast majority of combat is really you using your turn to spend your magic points and things to navigate your enemies, to utilize your minions effectively, which is mostly using them to attack the actual enemies, but again, your minions don't really have a lot to do until you get the summons, which are stronger anyway and have their own move sets. It doesn't help then that much of combat is mostly down to just overwhelming force through sheer numbers, and as a result of this, I can see why they added the option to skip combat entirely via story mode and the combat rating options. Combat is not this game's strong suit. It's there, it's perfectly okay, I suppose, but it's definitely not the best thing this game has going for it. And while I, of course, did a playthrough with all of the combat, I gotta say I honestly preferred just turning it off and enjoying the story. That brings us to our Steam Deck section, though. Officially, this game has a Steam Deck rating of unknown, but the Steam Deck is perfectly capable of playing it and does quite well, as it has things like Steam Cloud support on top of controller support. So, when this game eventually gets an actual rating, I assume it will probably be verified, especially with things like the scalable text and everything. That's usually a big deal with Steam as well, so perfectly valid way to play this, and I doubt you'll run into too many problems. But if you do, I suppose let me know. Should be pretty well good to go, though. That brings us to our positives and negatives, then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, as I mentioned, the story, very good. I really enjoyed getting to the bottom of this stuff, all the esoteric nature of it, the arcane manipulations, how it interacts with the city itself. I was a big fan of the city and the systems there where you have to actively hide what you're doing, evade suspicion, be careful about who you reveal things to, all that sort of stuff. On the negative side, for me, it basically comes down to the combat system. I honestly just really enjoyed skipping it all together, which I think says just about everything there is to know about it, but it's a very simple system, and it's not like the worst thing I've ever played or anything. It's just very basic, and more often than not kind of just got in the way of the stuff I actually wanted to be doing. And speaking of the things I actually wanted to be doing, the other negative for me is that oftentimes the game is not great at actually giving you the information you need. And as I mentioned, there is an element of that is yeah, that's kind of the point of the journey, that you have to figure this stuff out. But other times, it really is just the case of the game doing a honestly bad job of conveying certain things, usually to do with the game's combination system, as you have to combine a lot of items regularly. To give an easy example of this, there's a moment where you need some of your own blood, and up to this point, every time you've needed an item, it's something you have to gather and then actually use in the combination system. But in that one particular instance, it actually does that by itself when you are mixing all of the other ingredients together, and just stuff like that I think could be better explained to the player in the relevant moments, which would, I think, alleviate some of the frustration of certain individual story moments. And while it's definitely not something you can't figure out or anything, it does happen enough to be kind of a nuisance, and certainly result in things taking longer than they probably would otherwise. All of that does bring us to our conclusion, though. So, the Necromancer's Tale is honestly a slower-paced examination of someone's descent into the dark arts as they tread the path of a necromancer, and it does that experience extremely well. And if you want that experience, then for the game's base asking price of $25 US, though it is on a launch discount for the next week, making it $22.5, but a very reasonable price, I would say, for how much I got out of this game, which makes it pretty easy to recommend overall. I would just say that it's a very specific experience, and if that's the experience you want, it's awesome. Otherwise, it's probably not going to do much for you. But either way, I thought it was great. I had an awesome time with it, so it of course gets a buy out of me. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.